Welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Navé, always airing first on WPVM LP, Asheville 103.7, streaming online, WPVMFM.org. The voice of Asheville heard all over the world and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song, walterparks.com. For more on Walter's music, Devine Dial, thank you for managing WPVM-FM in Asheville. Robin Collier for doing the same in Taos, New Mexico. I do appreciate that. You can reach me, Navé, at jamesnavé.com. I'd love to hear from you. Today, my guest is David LaMotte. David and I have known each other for many, many years. We've worked together very often in collaboration with Leaf Global Arts Project. David's a songwriter. He's a speaker, he's an author. David has performed over 3,500 concerts and released 13 full-length CDs of primary original music. And he's toured all 50 states and on 5 of the 7 continents. David is also curious and is asking a lot of questions about our culture today. So when we connected on Zoom, we just started talking. Took us about a minute to realize the radio conversation had already begun. And he leads us into this conversation by telling us he's a bit wobbly today. It's a very important point because wobbly comes in to the conversation at the end as well. You'll see how that plays out. So here's David talking about wobbly, and then we'll go from there. Enjoy.
Well, I'm seated at the moment, and that's good because I'm a bit wobbly. When people ask me how I'm doing these days, I say many ways.
What makes you wobbly?
Concern for the future. Concern for my son, the planet he's inheriting. Concern for a lot of people that I love that are going to be marginalized by this incoming administration, and not just marginalized, but targeted. And that concerns me deeply. Lots of people I love are in danger.
I get all of that. I could be wobbly. I could be. And I refuse to be. I have the same concern you do. Basically, a wave of bullies getting ready to take over America. Donald Trump now has become the myth of America.
I'll say, as with, Niels Bohr gave us some beautiful wisdom when he said that there are 2 kinds of truth. There's simple truth and profound truth. And the opposite of a simple truth is a falsehood. And the opposite of a profound truth is very often a profound truth. So I can affirm what you just said, and at the same time deeply affirm its precise opposite. So much more to America than, and there still is, that didn't change a few days ago. The people we know of deep conviction and wisdom and compassion, they didn't disappear.
No.
Not going to. They're still here. I want to assert that that's also America.
And what I mean by Donald Trump being the myth of America, in the minds of a large percentage of people, he has established himself as the ideal they have always thought they would like to have as their measure.
Yeah.
Whether it's right or wrong, there it sits. It's not mine.
Yeah.
I'm in your camp.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a lot of people who are very, I'm afraid. And there's like withering. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe people will wither because they don't know how not to. Artists, it's their day. Now is our time. This is what we do. This is why we've been on the scene. It's easy when it's easy, but when it gets hard like this, it's time to just engage the spine and say, okay, fine. I have all of these concerns, and I do have a lot of concerns. It makes me feel bad to think these guys are getting ready to just wipe thousands and thousands of people in a direction they don't want to go in. And they're going to do it in a mean-ass way, too. It won't be something that's easy.
Yeah, including people that I know and love very much.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
that's hard. But yeah, I hear and agree that, yes, artists have a great deal of work to do right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And it may be we are in exactly the right place. It may be this is the time for America to fully experience what these people on the right have been organizing for the last 30 years. Now they are in a position to absolutely deliver everything they say, and they're telling me it's going to make my life 100% better. Okay, so go to it. You have 4 years. Let's see what happens. And it may be this kind of experience is what is required for people to look at it and think, my God, this does not work. I don't think it will. I think it's going to tumble.
Yeah. But so many people are going to suffer on the way. And generally not folks who look a lot like you and me, but a lot of people are going to suffer.
I know they will suffer. People will suffer unduly. People have been suffering since the beginning of time. And sometimes it just doesn't come as close to home as it does when we know somebody who's suffering. But, think about the horrors that are going on in this world. Think about the stuff. You know as well as anybody. You write about it. So, yeah, people are going to suffer. And I know people who will suffer, and it's going to be horrible. And it's going to be, in some ways, a byproduct of the human activity, whether I like it or not. Now, what I can do is create a window around me or a room around me where people don't suffer, where I can do things that will ease that. And I do it every day.
Yeah. That's my hope as well, and my intention. And I do want to also fiercely claim my joy, because I do think that withering that you spoke of is not really a helpful response. And if we don't allow ourselves ever to be joyful because are horrific things going on in the world, then there is never, ever a time for joy, because there are always horrific things going on in the world. So we do have to carve out that space and fiercely defend it. Yeah.
Which brings us to emotionalism. It brings us to the atmosphere we all have filled with all kinds of emotions: fear, wobbling, joy, excitement,
Courage,
temptation, guilt, doubt. On it goes. And they all operate at the same time in our system. So, and yet the positive ones like joy, oh my God, I love it when I feel joy because I've seen beauty. I love it when I get so happy because somebody invited me to the party. On it goes. Somebody cheers somebody on. I love it. So I think it's important to acknowledge that all of these emotions exist, and when they come up, allow them to be part of the process. And then another one pops up and another one. Doesn't change the horror, the rough stuff that's out there, the war that's going on, the person that's boxed in that can't get out. Yeah. That's there. So we are a part of all that we have met. So I believe we've already started the interview, whether we like it or not.
It seems that way, yeah.
I'm beginning to do my interviews more these days with just conversations with people rather than an interview, because I love the podcasts that have the conversations in them. And you and I have known each other forever, it seems like. And
yes,
we dropped into many, many conversations. And so I am also just thinking about all of the people that I know in Western North Carolina. I wasn't there when the flood hit. I was in New Mexico, in the dry desert of all places. No problems there at all with rain and water. Plenty of potential for fire, which is another kind of storm, of course. So I've watched much of what you are doing, interacting with the community, showing up where you can, and the role that you play and the role that you've played with Leaf Global Arts, which is something else we can also talk about as well in this conversation. And the role of leader, your TED Talk, the music you play, the songs you write, the books that you write. How has all of that work informed your strengths?
That is a fascinating way to put that question. Yeah, let me think about that a little bit. So I would say that sometimes I'm a leader in the sense that the job of a leader is to invite other people into the work, as opposed to the job of a hero, which is to do it for them. And I contest hero mythology, as you know, at most opportunities. But I believe in movements. I believe in a lot of people doing a little bit each and moving things in a better direction. And so sometimes I'm a leader and sometimes I'm a follower. Sometimes I answer someone else's invitation. And I think that follower role in some ways is more important because a movement without a leader sometimes happens. You see that from time to time. It's rare, but it does happen. A leader without a movement gets nothing done at all. So I think it's really important to validate the small efforts that we can make because they really are what the big changes are made of. That's not to blow sunshine and say, all noble small efforts lead to something bigger. I don't think that's true. That hasn't been my life experience. I've tried lots of things that have not worked. But I do believe that all large-scale positive change, at any rate, is made up of millions of small actions, many of which were determinative. The big thing could not have happened without all the little things. So I believe in showing up. Well, I believe in believing, right? To choose hope, which is very different from optimism. Optimism being an observation, I think everything is going to come out okay, at least in my lexicon. And hope is a choice. It's not an observation. It's not passive. It's entirely active. So it's possible to be pessimistic and still hopeful because you refuse to slide into despair, because despair leads to inaction. And inaction, in a political sense, rarely leads anywhere good.
So hope usually is a futuristic proposition. I hope for this outcome. The way I'm hearing you, hope is more a fuel for the present.
And setting your direction from your compass. I love the words of Václav Havel, a great poet and playwright, as you know, who led the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. And he was a rare creature in that he was an actual practicing, respected artist and a head of state. Those two things seldom intersect in my experience. Not to take anything away from George Bush's paintings, but, Václav Havel said, hope is not prognostication. It is an orientation of the spirit. So it has nothing to do with what we think is going to happen and everything to do with where we are going to point our lives, sometimes in spite of the odds rather than because of them. And I think all these common words like hope and love and peace and justice and those words that we throw around, each of them has a cheap definition and a deep definition. And people will often make an effort to dismiss the deep thing by dismissing the cheap thing. Well, the cheap thing should be dismissed. Pollyanna kind of optimism that everything's going to work out, just chill out, is not really helpful or accurate. But deeper hope that's not predicated in looking away from what's hard, but in believing that there's light on the other side of the darkness because you've seen it happen in your life, you lived it. And so you know. And so you point yourself toward that even though you can't see the light.
Why do you think people discount the little things they do? Why do you think they not value them? Because the little things build the house, the one block, the one brick.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two main reasons. One, because hero narratives are so deeply ingrained into certainly our culture and to some degree human nature in general, that where one person comes and does something dramatic and saves the day and fixes the problem, and then we get to move on to the next problem. That is how we tell history, even though it's not how history happened. And if we drive to the nearest movie theater and look at the 15 movies on the marquee, most of them have that plot. So we're swimming in that narrative all the time. And like racism or sexism or any number of other things, if you're soaking in a narrative your whole life, it guides your actions whether you like it or not to some degree. And I do think we can moderate that influence by paying more attention to it. We can learn better ways. But I wrote a whole book about this, and I'm not free of its influence. So I think one of the reasons is that we're soaked in this narrative, that it's only the dramatic things actually matter. When you open the news and you say, that's terrible, but what am I supposed to do? I'm not Gandhi. I'm not king, right? That's a hero narrative saying that if you're not that kind of extraordinary, special person in some way, then you can't have any impact. So I think that's one reason. The other reason is kind of grows from the first one, which is that, hero narratives are easier because in the hero narrative, my only job, if I'm not the hero, is to clap. And that's a pretty sweet gig. A movement narrative asks you to show up and do the work, the undramatic, boring, tedious background work that nobody's going to clap for. And that's where the magic happens. But it's not super exciting and fun most of the time. I mean, there are beautiful benefits to it. You get to be a part of a community, which is, a deep human need and a beautiful thing. But it doesn't sound very glamorous. We would rather ride in and save the day. We saw this with the hurricane relief, by the way. People showing up with all their gear, wanting to come be heroic, when what we really, really needed was a lot of supplies that needed to be moved around. There were these heroic moments, and they were great. Bless those people who showed up and did that. I'm not meaning to take anything away from that, but I have just as much respect for all these folks who spent long days moving stuff back and forth to get it to people who needed it while they pulled through the drive-through in front of the church, that saved lives as well.
It's interesting as you were telling that story, I'm thinking about when I used to be involved with TEDx New York salons. We gathered every Friday, showed a TEDx talk similar to the one that you gave, and then we would circle up for 45 minutes and discuss the talk. And sometimes we would have the speakers show up and be there to answer questions or whatever. And it was a quick in and out Friday afternoon from 5 to 6:30 or so. And then people went on their way to do whatever they did for the weekend. And I was always there, one of the organizers, and my job was to arrange the chairs. So I was often there early arranging the chairs, and people would come very eager, and they would come up to me and say, I would love to have a TED Talk. I would like to get more involved in this. Who can I talk to? And I would say, well, if you'd like to be involved with our community, we have all these chairs. Would you help me organize the chairs? And they would go, I don't have time. I'm going to go talk to this person. So they would spot the most famous person in the room, or at least whomever happened to be standing the tallest with the most confidence, seemingly, and they would engage them. It was always interesting when those people ended up in the audience ready for the event that I stepped up and said, I'm one of the organizing members. Tonight I'm facilitating this event, and I'd like to welcome all of you to TEDx New York Salon. And they were just, and you could see it. And I always knew the ones who would really be involved with us, and there were plenty of them, they always moved the chairs.
Yep.
But the ones who didn't move the chairs went away because they were seeking fame, perhaps. I don't know. I've never heard the term fameism. I don't even know if there's such a thing, but there might be. So that's exactly what you're talking about, David.
It is
exactly the same thing.
Yeah. I think that's just a fabulous story and very illustrative of what I'm trying to say. And it echoes a story that I experienced in New York one time that was also about moving chairs that kind of made the same point. It's I think that's an excellent example.
So what happens to people when they start to think about the difference between the fame, achieving that heroic moment, and then when they transfer that energy over to more of movement energy? And I would love for you to reflect on fame a bit, because it seems to be quite a motivator. It's really a bit overrated, I think.
I entirely agree. Yeah. So, in terms of what happens to people, of course, people aren't monolithic and lots of different things happen. But one of the things that I find in having this conversation with people around the difference between hero narratives and movement narratives is that there are a lot of good folks out there who want to have an impact in the world, but are so soaked in the hero narrative, and which includes the specialness of the hero, and don't feel special in that way, right? So that's buried in the lie that of course that it is a certain kind of person who becomes a hero. That's not true. It's just people, right? People make decisions, and it would be wonderful if we defined hero as someone who did something heroic. But I think that's not really how we use the word. We use that term to set people aside in another category. So I tell a story sometimes about a man named Wesley Autry rescued someone from the train tracks in a subway in New York City back in 2007, January 2007. And it was just an extraordinarily courageous thing. It was beautiful what he did and should be celebrated. But I tell people about what he did, jumping down in the tracks, and there's a train coming, and he lies down on the young man who he's helping and pins his arms and legs down so that they won't be cut off by the train. It's a very dramatic story, and I'll tell it in a fairly dramatic way when I'm leading a workshop. And it's very interesting to ask people afterwards, so when I told you that story, did you think to yourself, yeah, that's probably what I would have done? Almost nobody says that, right? People laugh and say, no, actually, I thought I could never do that. So telling that kind of story, which is intended to be motivational, actually is demotivational because it reinforces the line between me and heroes, right?
Mm.
So when I can help myself and people around me to deconstruct this hero narrative and look instead at the truth of movement narratives throughout history. And it's been my finding that we have a tendency to take movement stories of change and carve away facts until they are hero stories, because we kind of prefer hero stories. They're easier, right? They're easier to tell, but they're also easier on us because our only job is to clap. So when I kind of add back in the history of how movements actually make the change, a lot of people leave feeling less powerless, right? Feeling more capable of affecting change, feeling a restoration of their agency. And that's a good thing for us to remember that we are not powerless. But our power doesn't lie in being heroic. Our power lies in community. It lies in showing up together to figure out what we need to do, how we're going to do it, who's going to do which part, when we're going to meet together to talk about this again and figure out next steps. And that's strangely really encouraging and exciting for folks a lot of the time. And it is for me when I'm feeling really, really stuck and overwhelmed by the enormity of things that I'm up against and that we're up against. Doing one small thing in community with other people goes so far to restoring my own sanity.
I'm thinking of movement story, and I've known you again, like I say, for a long time, and I know that this is part of what you do and encourage people to do, and to some pretty good success. I have to say, you've gotten a lot of people working in this direction, and yet the movement idea can go in both directions. Just because it's a movement doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have a fantastic outcome. A movement could go in the opposite direction. It could become an awful experience for somebody. Can you reflect on that? Because it's not a one-sided thing.
No, it's not. So I put out a book summer before last, and it was an update of an earlier edition of ideas along the same lines. And one of the updates, it's about 30% different from the original text. And one of the things that I had come to reckon with in between the publication of those two books is that there are a lot of toxic movements out there, right? So there's no question that folks are motivated to do horrific things through movement mentality as well. In between the publication of these two books, we had the Charlottesville rally, or Unite the Right rally, for instance. And that's deeply disturbing. But what I find is that the way to effectively weaken those movements, frankly, is once again through smaller efforts. It's a one-on-one relationship. The people that I have known who have really turned around from really toxic things to really life-giving things have done so because of personal relationship consistently. So I have a friend in Tennessee who was actually a grand wizard in the KKK. And he ended up going to a rehab program. He got pulled over because he was drunk and driving. The police found an unregistered gun beneath the seat of his car. So the combination of these crimes had him up against some serious years in prison. And his lawyer suggested, hey, I've got a trick for you. Here's what we're going to do. We are going to have you sign up voluntarily for a residential rehab program. And then when we get to sentencing, they'll go lighter on you because you're taking these proactive steps to clean up your life. And he thought, okay, great. That's a great scam. I can do this residential treatment thing, and then I'll come out and get back to my own life the way it was. That'll be fine. And so he went to this residential treatment program. And as it turned out, he went through that program with two Black men who he came to know and love and respect very deeply. And the cognitive dissonance between who these men were and the ideology that he had been espousing was too much. And he had to change. And when he came out, he renounced the KKK, and now he does anti-racism workshops. He's a remarkable guy. And that came about because of human relationship. It came about because of love, right? And we kind of roll our eyes when people start talking about love as though that's a very soft and not very powerful force in the universe. And I find just the opposite. It is the most powerful force in the universe. I know some folks from Northern Ireland, Lee and Fiona. Lee is a former British police officer. Fiona had her older brother, whom she loved very much, killed by a British police officer. They are best friends, though they were on opposite sides of this violent conflict. They've come to know and rehumanize each other. And in rehumanizing each other, we rehumanize ourselves, right? So that human relationship, that effort that doesn't look so dramatic most of the time, is what brings about the change.
How do you know when you are in a movement? And I'm now thinking about Leaf Global Arts, an organization you and I both have been involved in since the start, all years ago, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
It's a huge movement, I think, a huge organization. Jennifer Pickering has done a great job of getting people engaged. When the flood hit, the hurricane hit Western North Carolina, Jennifer's crew engaged, helping everybody they possibly could. The Leaf Festival was called off, and I said to Jennifer the other day, but you had another kind of Leaf Festival.
Yeah.
People showed up and started lifting trees off of lawns, etc. And yet, I don't ever hear Jennifer referring to the Leaf Global Arts organization and everything everybody does as a movement. How do you know when you have one?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think actually you're going to hear Jennifer using that kind of language more and more and more. She's been doing a deep dive on my book. So I think I'm gonna give her that language. She's been doing the work. It's just language for what she's been doing forever, right? She's an example of the kinds of things that I'm talking about in the book. So I'm just slapping words on it. But I think you know that you're in a movement partly because you see your movement's effect in the world, and partly because you feel so at home when you show up there, right? There is a sense of solidarity in movement work that is so very deeply nourishing. One of the fundamental qualities of being a human being is a sense of belonging, needing to have a sense of belonging and needing to actually belong. When I was pretty heavily involved in the Moral Monday movement, marching in those parades, in those marches through Raleigh with every skin tone imaginable and every age imaginable and a broad spectrum of life experience there, and everybody trusting everybody and feeling supported and held up. My goodness, that's a good feeling. That is a really good feeling. And it's the same kind of thing, frankly, that recruits folks into these very toxic movements. That sense of belonging is what is being offered. That's what's on offer. My friend who was recruited into that when he was a high school student was not a brilliant student. He was not an athlete. He had a very difficult home life. And these guys came up and said, "Hey, there's one good thing about you. Why don't you come to this meeting? Right? And we'll have your back." Well, nobody had ever had his back. It's not surprising that he said, "Sure, let's go. I'll try it out." And then fell deeper and deeper and deeper because for the first time in his life, a group of people saw value in him. There's zero justification for, and he takes deep responsibility for his choices here. He is not one to make excuses, but that's a very human thing to do, right?
Well, I'm also thinking now about scale. When you say movement, my mind goes to large.
Yeah.
We have scale, we have it to scale. And yet, can you have a petite movement? Something small that only plays out in a family? And at what point does it become a qualified movement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or is that even a measure?
I'm not sure what metric to put on that, but I think if we reorient from the question of what can I do to the question of what can we do and where is my we, that's a really good start, right? Like to ask where your people are, where are you going to find people who care about the thing you care about and gather and see what resources you have together and figure out what's possible with those resources and with the goals that you share. So yeah, I mean, I believe very strongly in mini movements, and sometimes that's an intervention in your family to deal with somebody who's engaging in really toxic behavior. If you recruit your siblings and aunts and uncles and parents and whoever sees the problem and wants to address it, and you address this together as opposed to trying to address it on your own, that's already a step toward movement work, right? And one of my favorite kind of mini movement experiences right around the beginning of the pandemic, just before the beginning of the pandemic, we gathered some folks together in Black Mountain to help sponsor a family that needed to get out of detention and needed folks to care for them. And it was just beautiful. That first meeting was just astounding. We spent 2.5 hours or so kind of laid out the issue and laid out the possibilities, and then had everybody self-select and separate out and go to different tables in the room that had their interests or areas where they might have gifts to offer. So for instance, there was a table for translation and interpretation. There was a table for transportation. There was a table for hospitality. There was a table for housing. There was a table for education. How do we get the kids plugged into the school system, and who will advocate for the things that will come up there, et cetera. And everybody self-selected. And then we had small group meetings around those tables and figured out what we had to work with and what our goals were and what our plans were, and exchanged phone numbers and email addresses. And we were off, right? And we welcomed a family shortly thereafter and looked after them for some time. And it was a beautiful experience because everybody showed up. If I had tried to do that by myself, I was kind of the instigator in this. But the main thing I did was gather everybody together and say, hey, let's organize ourselves and work on this.
You've mentioned toxicity a fair amount, and I know what toxicity looks like to me. Toxicity does require judgment. You often hear in lots of groups, I don't judge. I'm not a judgmental person. To judge toxicity is a very serious engagement around discernment. I am discerning this is toxic, and therefore this is not. I would like for you to play a bit in that arena, helping us understand how you make that judgment. What kind of measure qualifies something as toxic?
Yeah. Well, I would say that a toxic action is demeaning and damaging to the integrity and value, or perceived integrity and value, of another person. That doesn't mean confronting the other person. You can confront someone in a way that is respectful. But if you are tearing them apart, that's toxic. That's demeaning. And folks are toxic on the sides of issues that I agree with and on the sides of issues that I don't agree with. And I would like to advocate for healthier ways to be in this work, because I don't think we can use hatred to fight for love. I just don't think it works. You know that I have a master's degree in peace studies. I care a great deal about peace work. I've certainly met folks who identify as peace activists who throw shrapnel everywhere they go, right? And that's problematic. I want to hold up the dignity and value of other people and treat them accordingly. So the question of judgment hinges on several different things. You know, words are so slippery. Navé, you're a man who's made your whole life with words, and they can mean so many different things. So when we're talking about judgment, first we have to delineate, are you judging the person and their core identity, or are you judging their action and inviting them into a better way of being because you believe in them and know that they can do better, right? These are fundamentally different ways at it, right? To judge the worth of a person is a very different thing than to judge their action. Also, I think sometimes we use the word judge as a synonym for condemn. And these are different ideas as well, right? To place a value judgment on something, to say, you know what? I don't think that's helpful. I don't think that's good. I don't think that's the right thing to do. Those are statements of judgment. But to say, you are a piece of crap because of what you did, is a really different thing, right? That's condemnation. And it's judging the person rather than judging the actions. And so I think we've got to catch ourselves in that kind of thing. I will say again, at the risk of sounding naive, this work has got to be rooted in love, but not love in a cheap definition, love in a deep definition. We're not talking about be nice. Be kind is different from be nice. Be nice means you don't disturb the water, right? Let's just keep it all calm. Let's not talk about it. That's nice, right? But to be kind is to hold up someone else's value and dignity and respect them enough to engage in something that's difficult, right? So peacemaking for me is never about avoiding conflict. That's not to say that I never avoid conflict, but that's not my best work, right? Peacemaking is about approaching conflict in ways that are constructive rather than destructive. And the verb in that sentence is approaching.
On that note, I would like to shift a little bit into your art, what you do as a singer-songwriter. And the reason I want to do that is because you have been celebrated as a peacemaker, as an activist, as an author. I first knew you when your hair was down to your waist and you were singing songs as at the beginning of your singer-songwriter career. Can you help us, or can you frame the songwriting you do into the stories that you've been telling us? Why is this so important to you? And I mean, you're really good on the guitar and you do understand music, and you can tell the difference between when somebody's playing in the key of D and the key of F, so to speak. Talk about your art and tie that to what you are doing in your activist work.
Yeah. So I grew up, in my family, they call me group two. I have 3 older siblings, and then there's a big gap, and then there's me. So I grew up listening to all of their music, and they were listening to the 70s folk pop revival folks, you know. So I was growing up listening to Carole King and James Taylor and Jackson Browne and all these great singer-songwriters, and their songs really touched me. Even as a young man without a lot of life experience, I was moved by the depth and the emotional honesty of these songs. And so that really touched me. And years later, when I started to glimpse the crack in the door to the possibility of actually doing that myself, that was thrilling because it had mattered a great deal to me over the years. I used to say that I love music because it connects people. And I've stopped saying that because I think it's an imprecise and frankly inaccurate statement. I don't think music connects people. I think we are already connected by our common humanity. But music has the capacity to remind us of our connectedness. And that matters. I need to be reminded that I'm not alone. I need to be reminded that other people have felt and are feeling what I feel. That just, again, speaks to that need to belong and the need to remember that we're not alone. And we do live in a time and a place that leads to isolation and loneliness. Loneliness and isolation are pretty easy to embrace without even realizing we've done it. My friends came to visit from Guatemala years ago, and we tend to think about our financially poor Guatemalan friends and our financially rich American friends when we first glance at that situation. But they were heartbroken and deeply concerned for us that people in my neighborhood didn't really know each other very well. In my physical neighborhood, you get 2 or 3 houses away and you don't really know those people. And that was shocking for my Guatemalan friends. And they were deeply concerned about our social poverty. They were coming from a place of social wealth. Everybody in the village knows about everything that's going on in the village, right, in Sanchach. And so that was a real eye-opener for me. These are exchanges of wealth and ways to address poverty in various ways. So music wakes me up. It reminds me of who I am. It calls to the better parts of me a lot of the time. And that's what I want to do. That's what I do as a listener. I respond in that way. So I think it's pretty natural to want to be that for other people. Now, I don't love when people try to make a political point in a song, try to tell me what to think, what to believe, what faith I should be. I find that offensive, frankly. So I don't want to do that. But I can speak my truth and see if it resonates with yours. Right? If I can do that in an artful way, I believe, and I would be curious as to your thoughts on this, Navé, but I feel like one of the core skills of a writer, of a songwriter in particular, perhaps a poet as well, and maybe other forms of writing, is to leave space in your writing for the listener's or reader's own experience, right? To give them a space to inhabit that they can sit down in and look around and say, oh, I know this place, right? But if it's just about me, that doesn't really matter that much, right? When I play a song, I have a song I wrote about my grandparents when I was quite young, still in my 20s, and I still sing it pretty often. It's one that people ask for. After they died, I wrote this kind of poignant song about my grandparents. And people very often cry when I sing the song. And it occurred to me somewhere along the line that these people had never met my grandparents, right? They were not crying for my grandparents. My grief was touching their grief, and they were crying for people that they had known and loved and lost. And I think when we connect in that way, when we can carry a little bit of each other's grief, we're more human and more alive.
Yeah, when you are making room for the listener or the audience members to participate, which is even deeper listening, where you're actively, almost physically involved in the presentation given on the stage, when the presenter makes room without doing too much editorializing about what I should think,
Yeah.
I, the audience member, suddenly start to connect with that piece as if I'm singing it. You are no longer doing it. David LaMotte is no longer up there doing it. That is me, because that is my story, and I'm running my own documentary film. At the end, I clap and give you credit for doing this work that brought me into that.
Holding up this mirror.
Yeah, it's a mirror. It's fantastic. And that's what I think we can attempt to do when we create material that goes out. I try to do that in these shows. I've done over 300 of these interviews now, over 9 years.
Yeah.
And I try to give enough space so that we can do what we're doing right now. We're not telling people what to think. We're just letting people engage in this mysterious inquiry that we're doing, which is always mysterious because we don't know what's going to happen next.
Exactly. Yeah. So I do love music. And of course, there's the instrumental part of music too. I've been talking to you a lot about words, and words are very, very important to me, as I know they are to you. And that matters. But there's also just the pure music. One of the things I love to do every night is play this instrumental song that I wrote called Shadows. I say I wrote it. I've never written it down. I just made it up, and it changes a little bit every time I play it. It's a sort of improvisational instrumental piece, and I get really lost in it. I play it pretty much any show I ever do. I play that song, and I go deep into it. And when I look up at the end of the song, I'm kind of surprised that there are people there, right? I'm lost in this little world. And there's something about those particular combinations of frequencies that connect up with my soul in a way that I cannot begin to understand or explain. And I find that really fascinating. I mean, theology and music, let's go bigger than music. Theology and art are kind of both fascinating to me because I don't understand them, right? It's not about having answers. I feel power here, and I want to stand closer to that, right? I want to understand it in my spirit, whether or not I will ever understand it in my brain. But one of the things that somebody pointed out to me somewhere along the line that I find utterly fascinating is that when you say music moves me, that's actually a literal statement. A sound wave goes all the way through your body and jiggles every atom, right? Every cell of your body wobbles just a little bit as that sound wave goes through your body, right? So that kind of realignment that I feel when I listen to really rich music, I'm fascinated by what's going on even on a physiological level when that happens.
I love that you just said wobbles, because we are at the time when we have to close our show. You started out telling me you were wobbly. And I said, well, I don't feel wobbly. I feel something else. And now you finish our time together using the word wobble in a way that I wasn't thinking about. So I think now I'm ready to wobble because it's actually a fantastic idea. The music goes through me and I wobble or wallow or
your body, every
celebrate.
cell of your body.
Oh my
Right.
gosh.
So I mean, I can only end with the time-honored wisdom that weebles wobble, but they don't fall down.
Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. Oh, fantastic. David, thank you for taking the time. We can do this again anytime. I'd love to talk to you. We could go on for hours, but there does come a time when the hour's top arrives, and that's where we are now. So thanks so much.
What a joy. Always good to see you, my brother. And thank you for this rich conversation.
So there you go, my friends. Thus concludes my conversation with David LaMotte. I've always enjoyed my connection with David, as you know, and we talked about that a bit during our conversation. Toward the end, I asked David to talk a bit about his music, and he did. So what I'd like to do now, give you a sample of one of David's songs. It's titled Angelita. Here you go.
The ground beneath my feet became the tree that stands beside me, and avocados hanging from that dusty roadside tree. I'll eat that avocado with my breakfast in the morning, and the ground of Guatemala will become a part of me. They're burning off the cane fields 'cause it's almost time for harvest. Those leaves will slice you bloody, so it's best when they're not there. You've stirred that very sugar in your Guatemalan coffee. It inhabits your own body like this smoke hangs in the air. This country seems so far away, so strange and unfamiliar. It's closer to your body than the steaming cup you hold. Am I my brother's keeper? No, I'm just my brother's brother. And the family's got some work to do to love each other whole. Burlap bag rides heavy on the bent back of an old man. His skin is thick as leather and his body knows that weight. In my country we complain our cup of coffee's too expensive. Don't say that to a man who trades $1 for a day. This country seems so far away, so strange and unfamiliar. It's closer to my body than this steaming cup I hold. Am I my brother's keeper? No, I'm just my brother's brother. And the family's got some work to do to love each other whole. La pequeña Angelita is sitting in a window, in a wall that's slowly crumbling but is painted brightest blue. She's laughing as she greets me, a weary extranjero. I will take this blessing with me, I will bring it home to you. I can't say that it's too far away, that this is not about me, as if her hopes and struggles are too much for me to hold. Am I my sister's keeper? No, I'm just my sister's brother. And the family's got some work to do to love each other whole. The family's got some work to do to love each other whole.
And that was Angelita by David LaMotte. So I'd like to say thank you ever so much for tuning into Twice 5 Miles Radio. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. As I've said many times, we are always airing this show first on WPVM LP Asheville 103.7, streaming online, WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song, walterparks.com for more on Walter's music. Davine Dial, thank you for managing WPVM-FM on Wall Street in downtown Asheville. Robin Collier, thank you for doing the same. KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio in Taos, New Mexico. I really do appreciate that. You can always reach me, Navé, at jamesnavé.com. Navé is spelled N-A-V-E. I'd love to hear from you. Tell me what your story is. How about that? I'd like to remind you we're sponsored by the Imaginative Storm Writing Project. If you'd like to improve your writing, imaginativestorm.com is a great place to start. I've been involved in this project for almost 5 years now with Allegra Houston, my creative collaborator. Every Saturday, we host an Imaginative Storm Writing Prompt of the Week gathering. It's always free, and we also host it on Thursday, Saturdays, noon Eastern Time, Thursdays, 6 p.m. Eastern Time, with people calling from all over the place. Door is always open. We only work for an hour, and we actually only write for 10 minutes. And yet, in that 10 minutes, all kinds of magic happens. So if you'd ever like to find out more about that and the other things that will help you with your writing, imaginativestorm.com is a good place to go to start that search. So on that note, once again, thanks for following along, tuning in, enjoying my conversation with David LaMotte. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you come back sometime very soon. Until then, I'll catch you on that turnaround somewhere down the line.